Hello and welcome to the Pastor's Study. So this is something of a bonus episode, I suppose, because my intention was for the last episode to be the last episode, at least for the summer, as we prepared for baby and so on. But with the events of this past couple of weeks, especially the events following the death of George Floyd and the protests against police brutality and the outcry of Black Lives Matter, it seemed like maybe I needed to say something to this, and maybe adding a bonus episode, I suppose, to this video series would be a helpful way to do that. So before I get into it, I want to tell you a little bit about how I've been mulling this over for the past couple of weeks, because I've really been wondering and wrestling with what my call is and how to address this. Because on the one hand, I'm not an expert in race relations. I'm not an expert in the history of policing, especially the history of policing in minority communities. I'm not an expert in the law surrounding police officers or even exactly in what the best ways to do these things are. So recently, in recent days, Minneapolis, for example, has announced its intention to disband and replace its police department. I'm not sure what that's going to look like, and I don't even know what the right way to go about that is or what the effect will be. So I don't come at these things as an expert. I could be wrong on these things. I don't know the experience of African Americans in this country, although I have seen a lot of evidence, and I know that the history of racism in this country is deep and really goes prior to even the founding of this country. So I guess the first thing that I want to say, again, I'm saying this not as an expert, but as a citizen of this country, and as a person that people look to for leadership. First thing is to say that the cry of Black Lives Matter is an important one, and it is a necessary cry right now. And perhaps you have been hearing the people that are upset with this outcry of Black Lives Matter, maybe because they feel like it's exclusive. So you hear the response cry, "All lives matter." But don't get distracted by that, because while of course it's true, all lives matter, it's also true that Black lives are the lives that are not mattering in our discourse right now and that need the attention. So an analogy, my favorite analogy that I've seen to explain this is, say you're at a dinner, family dinner, let's say, and your food gets served, so whoever's dishing out the food to each person, and one person's plate is empty. Let's say Bob's plate is empty. And Bob says, well, Bob needs food too. Or maybe you say, maybe it's odd for Bob to say that in his own voice. You say, Bob needs food too, right? So Bob needs food because Bob doesn't have any food. Everybody else's plate is full. And imagine that the person serving the food turned and responded to Bob, "Everyone needs food, Bob," and then just went about going about their business, not adding any food to his plate. While of course it's true, everybody needs food, Bob. The fact that that response is coming is actually shutting down the problem. The problem is that Bob doesn't have food right now, and so the correct way of pointing out the attention to that is saying Bob needs food. He doesn't have food right now. And the response of "everyone needs food," while technically true, is actually just covering over and silencing the problem. A similar thing is happening with Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter right now because Black lives are the ones who have historically mattered less than white lives in our country and have been treated differently and valued differently. And so the cry of Black Lives Matter is the right cry, not just for people of color, not just for African Americans, but for white people to be joining in and saying, yes, Black Lives Matter, because they have not been getting the value, the mattering that they deserve over this time. So first, I just want to get that out of the way. That supporting Black Lives Matter is something that is important for us as white people to do, because we, as the ones who have been valued in our society, sort of at the default level, need to turn attention to those whose mattering, whose value has been held below the default level. Now, of course, Black lives are not the only lives that have been devalued in the history of our country. Unfortunately, there are many others, but Black lives are the ones at the forefront now, and it is right to focus on them in the time being, I think. If you want another analogy for that, a biblical one, if you think of Jesus' parable of the shepherd who leaves 99 sheep behind to go and get the one, it seems if the 99 respond, well, we matter too, the emphasis is yes, but you're not lost. You're not the sheep that's lost. And so Jesus leaves the 99 to get the one sheep. There's something similar going on here with the cry of Black Lives Matter. Now, if only it were the fact that there was just one sheep that was lost. Unfortunately, there are many other sheep that also need to be retrieved, but one thing at a time. All that to say, I've been wrestling about what to say about this because I'm not an expert on this. I'm not an expert on the experience of policing or of Black lives or any of this. But I am an expert, or at least an authority, on the Bible and on Lutheran teaching. And so as I was thinking about what can I bring to this, what can I say that hasn't already been said, and isn't being said by people who are much better qualified and more competent to say it than me, is to ask, well, what does our Lutheran and Christian teachings bring that can help us think through this time of Black Lives Matter when there are protests in cities all across the country, and when there is violence actually happening in and among some of these protests, both by, I don't know, probably opportunists who are looking for the opportunity to, get away with some things from electronic stores or something like that, as well as people who are just really wanting to kind of tear the whole thing down, who are, sort of anarchists, as well as violence now against those protesters from the police side. We just see continual stories of police violence directed against protesters, often unjustified, at least from what I can see. Unjustifiable, I should say. And so what framework or what teaching do we have? And so I thought maybe we could think about this from the perspective of the Fifth Commandment. So the Fifth Commandment, in at least Lutheran and I believe Roman Catholic numbering, is the commandment, you shall not murder, or you shall not kill. It's translated a couple different ways. But the commandment not to murder or not to kill. This commandment is bigger than just the act of murder, as is clear in Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, as well as elsewhere. So let me just read the Small Catechism entry from Luther's Small Catechism on this fifth commandment, you shall not murder. So what is this? We are to fear and love God so that we neither endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors, but instead help and support them in all life's needs. Let me read that one more time. We are to fear and love God so that we neither endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors, but instead help and support them in all of life's needs. You'll notice there are, Luther does this with his explanations of all the commandments, but you notice that there's two directions that his explanation to this goes. On the one hand, there's a negative direction. This is what you are not to do. You are not to harm your neighbor. Remember, this is larger than just murder. You're not to put them in danger, right? So you're not to harm or endanger them. But then there's also a positive direction. What are you to do? Well, on the other hand, you are to help and support them in all of life's needs. So this commandment, you shall not murder, is not fulfilled just by refraining from the actual act of murder. It is actually fulfilled by helping and supporting your neighbor in their needs, in what they need, by helping to provide for your neighbor. We could say your fellow citizen, or actually it's even larger than that. It's not fellow citizen. It's not limited to nationality or to citizenship, but to your fellow community member, the people that you have relationships with, whether they are formal relationships where you know their name, or just the people that you live in the same area or the same state or the same nation as, or really the same world. You can say that every person who is in existence is your neighbor, and so which is sort of the point of Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan, if you remember that. So two directions: negatively to not harm or endanger, positively to help and support. Now, there's another catechism that Luther wrote called the Large Catechism, which really isn't that large, but it was more written for pastors. The idea is the small catechism was to be used by families in the household, and it was supposed to be short because most people couldn't read, and so it was supposed to be easily memorized. That's the idea of it. But the Large Catechism, Luther goes into a little bit more explanation, and so I want to just read a few selections from his description of this commandment in the Large Catechism. So, for example, he says this, the commandment is simple enough. We hear it explained every year in the gospel in Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ himself explains and summarizes it. We must not kill either by hand, heart, or word, by signs or gestures, or by aiding and abetting. So if you remember in Matthew chapter 5, for example, Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire." So Jesus here says this commandment is actually much larger than just the act of murder. This is what Luther's referring to. A little further on, he also says what the positive of this commandment is. This commandment, often we think of commandments as limiting in sort of a negative sense, like, oh, if these commandments weren't here. But they're limiting in a positive sense, in a protective sense. So what is God doing? Why does God give this commandment? Here's what Luther says. Here God, like a kind father, steps in and intervenes to get the quarrel settled for the safety of all concerned. Briefly, God wishes to have all people defended, delivered, and protected from the wickedness and violence of others. And God has set up this commandment as a wall, fortress, and refuge around our neighbor, so that no one may do our neighbor bodily harm. So God has given this commandment as a limit, you're not to do these things, but as a protection around our neighbor. You notice this. So God has intervened and set up this commandment as a way to say your neighbor ought to be defended, delivered, and protected from the wickedness and violence of others. And then one more. This is a little bit longer quotation, but I just think it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about. So he says, in the second place, this commandment is violated not only when a person actually does evil, but also when he fails to do good to his neighbor, or, though he has the opportunity, fails to prevent, protect, and save him from suffering bodily harm or injury. Then he goes into an example. This is based on Matthew 25. If you send a person away naked when you could clothe him, you have let him freeze to death. If you see anyone suffer hunger and do not feed him, you have let him starve. Likewise, if you see anyone condemned to death or in similar peril and do not save him, although you know ways and means to do so, you have killed him. It will do you no good to plead that you did not contribute to his death by word or deed, for you have withheld your love from him and robbed him of the service by which his life might have been saved. Therefore, now this is listen to this, because this is a hard word here. Therefore, God rightly calls all persons murderers who do not offer counsel and aid to people in need and in peril of body and life. Listen to that one more time. Therefore, God rightly calls all persons murderers who do not offer counsel and aid to people in need and in peril of body and life. Let that sink in for a moment. Withholding your love from a person in need, not exercising your ability to deliver somebody from what endangers them or to help them in the midst of it, is a violation of this commandment, you shall not murder. And therefore, as Luther says, God rightly calls us murderers when we do not act to come to the aid of our neighbor. Now that is a radical call on us, a radical demand on us that God has placed to care for the safety of our neighbors. So to reference another part in Scripture, in Genesis chapter 4, I believe, Cain and Abel. We remember the story of Cain and Abel, these two brothers, and Cain is jealous of Abel because Abel is gaining favor with God, basically, and so Cain kills his brother Abel. And God asks Cain a question later on. Of course, God knows the answer, but God says, "Cain, where is your brother?" And Cain replies, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And Cain clearly thinks that no, he's not his brother's keeper. But what does this commandment tell us? Yes, we are our brothers, our neighbors' keepers. We are responsible to the extent that we have the ability. We are responsible for the life and the well-being of our neighbors, just as they are, by this commandment, responsible for ours. So what does this have to do with Black Lives Matter? What does this have to do with the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, or all of the other black and brown people who have been systematically oppressed in our system for the past centuries, for as long as this country has been a country, and actually even before that? It means that we who are not under this system of oppression, which by and large is going to include white people, we who have power, we who have ability, we who have wealth, right? We who are not struggling for our daily bread, we have responsibility for those who are. We have responsibility to use our power, to use our voice, to use the value that has been placed upon us, to intervene when we see others, and especially those of other races, those who are powerless in society. And this isn't entirely race, right? I mean, this lines up with socioeconomic status, for being rich or poor, right? So people that are poor, people who are homeless, are often devalued and don't have the ability to care for themselves. So those of us who do have these things, and whiteness in this country is an asset, so being white is an asset. Those of us who do have those assets, who do have that power, are responsible to exercise it on behalf of our neighbors who do not have it. So what does this mean for the protests going on? It means that white people, and not just white people, but I'm a white person, so I'm speaking for white people. White people are obligated, or we have a command from God to aid in the protests. Now, that doesn't mean, go out and commit violence. And in fact, I think we can condemn acts of violence, individual acts of violence that are being committed, especially during those protests. But these protests aren't one thing. They're not all united. There are different groups with different interests here. And some of those interests are to cause chaos and disorder. And I think those can be condemned. But insofar as the vast majority of these protests are calling for the rights of black and brown people not to be disproportionately affected by policing, not to be targeted by police, not to be beaten and killed by police, we have a responsibility to join our voices with them, because our voices add to their voice. And because our society, wrongly, but this is how it is, our society attributes more value to white voices than it does to black voices. And by lending our voice, by lending our bodies, in the case of going to protests, by lending our power in our ability to vote, and to hold our elected officials accountable, we are responsible. We are called to do what we can to prevent their murder. We are called to do what we can to prevent their oppression and their being held down. We are commanded to do what we can to make sure that they have what is needed for their life and for their well-being. This is love. Remember, Jesus says all of the law and the prophets hang on the two commandments, right? The two love commandments. The first directed towards God: love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That is, love God with everything that you are. Everything that you are must be in service to God. This is part of what the law demands. And the second, he says, is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. So all of the law, all of the commandments hang on these two commandments. In fact, they're summed up in these two commandments: loving God with everything that we are, and loving our neighbor as ourself. And as you heard in Luther, when you fail to act when you can, you have withheld your love from that person, and you are therefore guilty of the commandments. Now, this is a hard word, and it's hard to know how to help, and it's hard even to know what we can do that is the right thing to do. As you know, so for example, the policy debate or all of the policy problems that are going to happen over the next several months as the city of Minneapolis figures out, what does disbanding a police department look like? What is the right way forward? And there are going to be mistakes made. And the fact is, we live in a world where I'd say maybe most of the time, it's not clear what the right path forward is. And very often there is no pure right path forward, right? Every action we take is a mix of good things and bad things. There is no pure good action available to us, or very rarely is there a purely good action available to us. And so as Christians, knowing that we are under God's commandment, as is actually all of humanity, the whole world is under this commandment of thou shalt not murder, you shall not kill, and knowing that this demands of us to love our neighbor and not withhold what they need for their bodies and livelihood, it means that we are going to be having to negotiate this constantly. Is it best to get involved in a protest, or is it best to stay home because, after all, there's a pandemic going on right now, and avoid crowds? Is it best to speak up and let my voice be heard in a public way, to change my profile picture on Facebook or that sort of thing? Or might it be best actually to keep quiet in a public sense, so that I can be more active in a private sense with my personal sense, I should say, with my personal relationships? Those are questions that need to be negotiated by each and every person. I mean, there's no one size fits all for this. I don't think the right course of action, the responsible course of action, is going to be different from one person to another. However, what is universal, I believe, is that everybody who has ability, who has power, who has a voice, is obligated to use that in service of their neighbor. And the neighbors that are particularly in danger, or maybe even more than that, the neighbors, the place in which there is an opportunity to make change in a way that there has not been for a long time, is regarding our African American neighbors, our black men and women who are our fellow citizens and residents with us in this nation. And of course, this is somewhat global too, but I think probably our power and our influence is limited once we get beyond our communities and our nation. And so it is right to exercise and to make those decisions, knowing that we have a responsibility to this. It is never right to say, and as some people may say, well, so long as I am sort of minding my own business, so long as I am not actively harming, black and brown people, so long as I am not actively committing racist evil in my community, I am fulfilling the fifth commandment. And I can tell you that no, so long as you are withholding your love, you are in violation of the fifth commandment, as Jesus himself says, as Luther says in the catechisms, as Moses says, right? I mean, Jesus, when he quotes "love your neighbor as himself," he's quoting Moses. He's quoting the Old Testament law. This has been consistent for as long as there has been law, for as long as there's been Scripture, in fact. Or, I mean, you can go back to Cain and Abel, and you can see, even though the commandments haven't been given yet at that time, it's very clear that Cain has sinned by killing his brother, and that he is wrong to claim he is not his brother's keeper. Yeah, that's probably enough for this. You've heard me talk long enough about this, I think. I hope that this has been helpful. And one more thing, actually, I want to finish on one more thing. So as I mentioned, there's no perfect actions here, right? We are going to be, it is not going to happen for any of us that we perfectly give our love to those in need. We are going to be withholding it. In fact, we have been withholding it. I'm guilty of this, and I'm certain that really all of us are guilty of this, that we have been living in violation of this commandment for a long time, and even the most extreme giving of ourselves to this cause will rarely actually be a full giving of our love. And in fact, we may make missteps. We may do things that are wrong. We may do things that we may make wrong actions that make things worse rather than better. Things are unclear, as I mentioned with the Minneapolis Police Department. There are a lot of ways that this could happen, this disbanding and recreating, or whatever it's going to look like, that could lead to worse outcomes. They have to be very careful with how they're doing this, but they're right to be trying to make change. And we may find ourselves actually doing things that, and seeing in retrospect that they were the wrong courses of action. So the last thing I want to say is that as Christians, we live in this world and strive to fulfill the law, to fulfill these commandments, such as this fifth commandment. And in doing so, we know that we operate under the forgiveness of sin, that we operate knowing that our efforts never are actually going to be enough, that we are actually incapable of fulfilling this to the extent that it ought to be fulfilled. And so we live each and every moment and each and every day in the knowledge of Jesus Christ's sacrifice for us, of Jesus Christ giving his life for us, of overcoming death and hell and the power of sin for our sake. And so, with that confidence that God that Jesus has done everything that is required for us, for our righteousness, we work for justice. We work to fulfill the law in this way, knowing that we will never be enough, and yet knowing that Christ is enough. And that before God, on account of Christ, our sin is forgiven, and our failings before this law and before these commandments and before our neighbors are covered by the forgiveness and the love of God that has been poured out for us. And so that means we can be active. We don't have to be overwhelmed by our inability to fulfill this commandment. We don't have to be defeated when we learn that our actions actually weren't as good as we thought they were at the time, because we know that Christ covers us and that God covers us, and that gives us actually the power now, the boldness, the courage to act, and to act boldly, and to step into uncertain futures and uncertain actions, knowing that God is the one who will guarantee our future, even though our actions are imperfect and uncertain, and we may not even know the fruits of them in our lifetimes. And yet, God has called us to faithful action here and now, in our context, in the ways that we are able to do. So I hope this has been helpful. I am very happy to continue this conversation. If you have questions, if you have disagreements, please feel free to reach out to me. Don't feel like you will be. Don't feel like I will shut you down or something if you disagree strongly with this. I'd love to hear from you and to continue and to have this conversation with you, and to be able to speak truly, and to recognize rightly what is being commanded of us and demanded of us in the law and in this commandment in particular. So I leave you with that, and know that you, as you make these hard decisions, that you have been covered in the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, and that God has already made an announcement about you, that you are God's beloved child, that you are God's chosen beloved, whom God has chosen to love, and that God is well pleased with you. And in the strength of that, in the power of that decision that God has made about you, go forth and do the very best you can for your neighbors who are crying out for your help and your aid.